In 1935, my father led an expedition up the Amazon into the jungles of Brazil. 60 years later, I decided to follow him. Some people said that what I finally did was eccentric, but I don't think it was eccentric to try to understand your father better and try to really find out what your father wanted for you. I think my father approached every day of his life as a little bit of an adventure, and I think he tried to put himself in a position where he would have somewhat of an adventure every day. And if he couldn't find one, he'd stir one up. He was a confirmed optimist, and he would come up with funny ideas that everybody said, yeah, I don't know where he's going now. But they had enough faith in him that they would carry out what he wanted to do, and whether it was a Frank Lloyd Wright building or an art exhibit or a trip to Brazil, he could persuade people to get with him on those things. Then, of course, he got this idea for the expedition and bought this wonderful airplane, the Sikorsky S-38 from the Chicago Exposition of 1933. At that time, there were few airports in the world, generally, and there were literally no airports on the way from Miami south. He had to land most of the time on the water. He really needed an amphibian. He wouldn't have been able to make the trip without both the land capability and the water capability. He decided to do this thing, which nobody really wanted him to do because the business was in such bad shape and it cost money to do this, and he had a family that he ought to be thinking about, but he gets into this peculiar-looking airplane and flies to Brazil. My father had to take over the family business, Johnson Wax, when he was 28. So from early on, he felt a lot of pressure. And I had it on me. My father's expectations of me were always very high, and I thought about doing other things when I got out of school and out of the Air Force. You know, why go there when I could be an airline pilot or whatever, or even a playboy. But by that time, I'd gotten to believe that this was a great place. Before my father died, he asked me to carve the leaf of the Carnauba palm on his tomb. That really is an unusual thing for a man from Racine, Wisconsin to want to be buried with a Brazilian palm on his tomb. After he returned from the expedition, Dad wrote a book about his adventure. Not long ago, I came across the copy that he inscribed to me when I was 8 years old. And when I rediscovered the book, and it said to Sammy, "I hope you make this trip someday," it changed my life. Love, Dad. And that's the one that impacted me, and that's the one I came across again, that's what I got to thinking, how did it change his life? And why did it change his life? My father wasn't a sentimental man, so after the trip, he sold the airplane to an oil company. Later, we heard that the oil company pilot crashed the airplane into the waters of New Guinea. As the years went by, that plane became such an important part of how I remembered my father that I decided to search for it. There was something on it that I wanted.
Nama saya Yohanes P. Turumpabe. My name is Johannes Piet Rumfabe. I'm 70 years old. I remember very well when this plane crashed, because that's the only thing what I remember from my childhood. The pilot was taxiing out towards Lemon Island, and from the west a very big storm arrives. He turned his airplane, the wind got stronger, more lightning, more thunder, and the moment where he wants to take off, there's a very strong wind, and the plane just flipped over. He flipped over on his wings. We were shocked. My friends and me, we were shocked. We went out to the place where the plane crashed, and he just disappeared into the blue. What could we do? The sea has taken it. We could do nothing. So after that we went home. It's like this, what the sea takes, it takes forever. Doesn't give it back.
I wanted to find the Carnauba so that I could get the nameplate off of it that identified that airplane as my father's. I told people that it would be an adventure, especially for my sons Kurt and Fisk. But that wasn't all. Do you recall back when you were growing up, there was that special drawer of your father's? And in it was a certain possession of his, maybe a pocket knife or a watch or something that he had found. And somehow it symbolized to you who he was. That's really why I wanted to find that data plate on that airplane, so that I could get it, hold it in my hand, take it home, and put it in my own special drawer. We talked about it a lot, and we thought after 60 years, 65 years, that the wood would be all gone because the water was so warm down there, and that what would remain would be maybe the hard metal pieces that were encrusted in barnacles or whatever, but at least there would be enough form to, to find something in it. And we didn't know exactly where the data plate would be. We thought, well, we'd have to look around. It's someplace up in the cockpit. But we didn't expect very much. The more we got into it, the more we realized that there wouldn't be anything usable on this. My sons dove time and again. I knew they weren't doing it just for the adventure. They were doing it for me. In the summertime, when Dad and I were up to the lake together, I'd wake up and he'd say, "Sammy, today we're gonna go find the headwaters of the something creek." And so we got his map out and we figured out where we would have to go cross country, and we got our compasses and everything all figured out. When we started charging through the woods, we never did find the headwaters of the creek. But it was a wonderful day because we got in the woods, we had an objective, it all seemed to come together, and then at the end of the day, it was a great experience, even though we didn't reach our objective. The point was that the search itself was worthwhile. We never found my father's plane. The old man was right. What the sea takes, it takes forever. I was disappointed, but I began to get this idea that some people thought was crazy. But something was telling me to do it. I decided to recreate my father's airplane and retrace his journey. Well, Gene said that one of the reasons that I took this trip to Brazil in this airplane was to spend more time with my father after all these years. I think that there's something to that, although I didn't realize it at the time that I was thinking about the trip. It took 3 years to turn a memory into an airplane. Only about 100 of the S-38s were made, and none of them have survived. We had to search around in the archives of the FAA and the Sikorsky Aircraft Company, and we were able to get pretty good plans. We didn't have very many pictures of the interior or the details of various components and how they fitted together. So there had to be quite a bit of educated improvisation that had to be done by those people in Owatonna. They were very talented guys. This airplane was so important to me that to see it kind of grow. And I used to go over there about once a month just to see what was happening and talk with the guys that were building it. And they seemed to respond to my enthusiasm for the project. It was a very special thing. And then all of a sudden, after 3.5 years, this wonderful piece of machinery, all complete, emerged from the hangar. You know, I couldn't believe it when I finally saw it all done. It was so so beautiful. People normally don't love machines, but this airplane is a work of art. In his later years, if he saw that airplane, if he'd have lived long enough to see that airplane, and particularly after his stroke, he would have been just enlivened, I think, that I had done this, that I'd thought enough of what that trip was to put all the time and money and effort into rebuilding a memory.
Southeast 150 degrees to 12 knots. Negative traffic reported. Altimeter 3016.
Racine traffic. Experimental 6 Victor is taking the active 1 for right-hand turn.
Okay, you ready to go, folks? Here we go, Roger.
I have a passion for flying. Part of the passion is the freedom it gives you to do what you want to do. And that means that you can go down to the hangar, push your airplane out, fill it with fuel, and then look up in the sky and think about the weather, and you say, where am I going to go today? Once I got it in the air, I realized that this is a docile, wonderfully flying airplane. And for the first time, you hear that wonderful sound that that thing has, and then you put the throttle forward, and it was exciting. And it's a fine airplane, a little heavy on the controls, particularly the banking. But on the pitch, it was very easy.
6 Victor Racine unit time. Your winds will be 150 at 10 knots. You're aware of the traffic, Roger.
So I flew it around a while, and my first landing wasn't all that bad. After years of planning and construction, I had finally flown my father's airplane. And I felt, as I would feel many times in the journey to come, that my father had flown with me. I suppose each of our lives is a series of takeoffs and landings, reunions and goodbyes. The earliest memory I have of my mother and father was not really understanding why they would not be together for the long term when they got the divorce. But years later, my father told me the reason that they got the divorce, which was that my mother was an alcoholic and he didn't know what to do. In the very early days, I couldn't understand why somehow she couldn't be all the time the way she was when she was sober, which was wonderful. But most of the time she wasn't, and that was the biggest disappointment. Coming with me that morning were my two sons. Coming along in my heart, the love of my wife, Jean, and the unselfish affection of my daughters, Helen and Winnie. They saved me for this day. Eventually, I developed my mother's disease after many years, and really had a hard time admitting it to myself because when I was a child, I said, the one thing I never want to be is like my mother in terms of this problem. And I did develop that. And after denying it several times in confrontation with the members of my family, they finally got me to admit that I had the problem and got me into the hospital where I needed to be in order to get well again. Alcoholics have difficulty recognizing that they have a disease. And that's why you get in such a state of internal frustration, because you know that you have to get the monkey off your back, the alcohol off, and you cannot do it. And that's why a lot of alcoholics suffer from severe depression, because they cannot figure out what to do. It was very difficult for me because I was the chairman of the board of the Mayo Clinic and had been for 7 years as I was kind of leading up to this alcoholic problem. And so they're trying to get me to go to the Mayo Clinic for treatment. And I mean, how can I walk in there? I'm the chairman of the board, and I'm walking into the addiction center at the Mayo Clinic. How do I do that? And I finally called up the head of the professional head of the Mayo Clinic, and he said, well, my brother's daughter just got out of the addiction center here for alcohol. And that kind of softened the blow for me, and so I walked in there one day, and 28 days later, I walked out, and I'm forever grateful that, but it was the family that pushed me into it. And I think one of the great values of a family is to help another member get over a problem like I had. When I signed into that hospital, I thought I'd never have fun again. I was wrong. In the cockpit, checklist complete, ready to go. And in my heart, my father's inscription, Sammy, I hope you can make this trip someday. My father wrote in his journal,
on the morning of October 1st, 1935, a twin-motor Sikorsky amphibian was ready to take off with 5 members of the first expedition of its kind ever attempted. We took to the air. At last, we were on our way to the land of the Carnauba.
An early environmentalist, my father was interested in the palm because the Carnauba wax that comes off the leaves are protected by the thick coating of wax that goes on there during the droughts. And that wax is the hardest known natural wax. It was the principal ingredient in all of our products at that time. We only made wax products back then. Going by sea and land, the search for the palm would have taken more than a year, but by air, it would only take a few months. Well, the pursuit of that plant is really the rationale for his trip to Brazil. It wasn't something of just taking an adventure in an airplane. He had an objective, and that was to make certain that we had an adequate supply of this unique ingredient. So his purpose for going to Brazil was a good one. It was really the substance of the survival of the company. The great thing about that airplane was that you felt connected to the land below. There was no point in going any higher because it didn't fly any faster higher. And also when the weather was bad, we flew low. And I can remember on a particular day when we were very low, about 100 feet above the trees or less. Every once in a while, we would come across a farm, and we could see the cows looking up, and the farmers, without exception, would look up and they'd wave and smile. But it was fun flying at that level, and it was at 90 miles an hour. Everything happens quite slowly. My father's trip was daring enough to be reported by Time magazine. 15,000 miles over seas, deserts, jungles. Flying over the Amazon was a dangerous thing in those days. He didn't have any options. If he'd lost an engine, he'd have to go into the river. And he would have, who was gonna pick him up? Who was gonna rescue him? There weren't any airplanes flying around. There was no satellite listening to a distress signal. He would be on the river, and then he'd pull up to the side, and he'd have to camp out there until somebody came and got him in a boat. But he seemed perfectly calm in his writing about flying up the Amazon when you read the book. That's where my admiration for him kind of went up, because he didn't worry about it. In that book, there isn't a worry about outcomes at all. He was going to do this trip, and he was going to come back alive, and he was going to be okay. And it turned out that way. We didn't take the kind of risks he had. So you think about what he did versus what we did. Then you begin to have some admiration for his guts and his persistence and his, and sometimes you could feel his voice, his urging. I'll never forget the letter that my father's secretary gave to me after his death. She told me that he had instructed her not to give it to me until after he was gone. That was a wonderful letter because he'd obviously thought about it a lot and had put it aside. It was written when I was in my 20s, and it began, "Dearest Sam." And he said that he had great confidence in me to carry on what he had started. And then he goes on to say that many people will tell you that you have not done the things the way I would have done them. And he said, pay no heed to that, because what you have to do is what you think is right for the company and its people at that point in time. He told me that he believed in me, that I would be a fine man. And most important of all, he told me that I had been a good son. And that, I think, is probably the most important thing he ever said to me. He signed it with great fatherly love. And I know he loved me, but I also know he loved to travel the world and enjoy himself. When he went around the world after his second wife died, and he was kind of on the rebound, and he said, I said, well, what are we gonna do? What are Karen and I gonna do while you go around the world? He said, well, I'm gonna let you visit with Aunt Henrietta. I'm just gonna drop you off at your Aunt Hen's for a while. It turned out to be a year. And he didn't apologize for that. He just said, this is what I'm gonna do, and he did it. And so when he came back, it was, he resumed his role as a more hands-on father, and I don't think I was any worse for wear. When I first was in charge of the company's business in Europe, I consolidated some factories, and everything got really messed up. In that period, we lost half of the company's total profits. And I was wondering what my father would say, but I got a phone call one day from him, and he said, what is going on? I said, well, I think we're doing the right thing, but I didn't do it correctly. And he said, what are you trying to do, wreck this company? I said, no, I'm not. And he said, well, I think I need you back here in Racine. I want you to come back. So I explained to him why we had done this, that it was the right concept for the long run, but I hadn't executed it very well. So I didn't get fired. But this was in the summer of 1965. And in the Labor Day, and my father just had turned 65. And it went on till Labor Day, and he had a stroke. And it was a serious stroke, and he was flattened. He lived and recovered somewhat, but I always wondered whether I had given him the stroke because of the mess up I'd made in Europe. And I'll probably never know the answer to that question. After his stroke, my father used to spend his winters in Florida. He would insist that I would come down there every other weekend to bring him up to date on how the business was doing. He couldn't read very well, and he couldn't write because his right arm was gone, but he would have the numbers for the company and have me go over them all in detail with him. And invariably, kind of at the end of the conversation, he would get exasperated with what he saw. He didn't like what he saw. And he would say, well, I don't like these numbers, and I don't like you either. And you're fired. And in the beginning, I used to say, well, you can't fire me. But I learned better after a while. I knew he was ill, and I knew his fuse was about that big because of the stroke. But when your father says, and I don't like you either, and you're fired, it can't help but get you. And I did this for years after. He lived for 13 years after his stroke. And every other weekend, in the wintertime, I'd be down in Miami talking with him, and it was tough. Sitting there in his wheelchair, looking out over the ocean, he must have remembered the time that he flew over those very same waters. As my father said in his book,
The Atlantic put on a gorgeous show of changing colors, from dark blues and violets to pale green that faded into yellow as we flew over hidden reefs.
like my father, our destination was Fortaleza, Brazil. Flying over the Caribbean day after day, a calm settled over the cockpit. I'm certain the same thing happened to my dad. As peaceful as the scenes were below, he was not so peaceful on the inside. The divorce from my mother, the strain of running the company since he was 28 years old, when his father had suddenly died, and the stress of the Great Depression, when he decided not to lay anybody off. I think he was looking for some answers to these questions about his future, and was hoping that by rediscovering the source of the Carnauba palm, which was the principal ingredient of the products in those days. It was the magical ingredient. It was the product plus, if you will. In the product was the Carnauba wax. And so he was chasing after the most important thing for the company, the thing that set us apart from everybody else, was that ingredient that made it a superior product. And so he had the right idea. You go after the most important thing and you try to make certain that it will continue. In 1938, when I was 10 years old, my father took me out of school to go to England with him. We got on the North German Lloyd liner, the Bremen, which became quite famous in World War II. And it was very rough crossing the North Atlantic, and this was in the winter. And one night he left me alone in the cabin while he went up and had fun. And the boat was tipping so badly that everything was beginning to fall around into the room, and the stuff was coming out of the sink, and the toothbrushes were falling on the floor and all of that, and I got frightened. So I went up to the bar in my pajamas, and he's sitting with about 3 or 4 women, and he said, "Oh, hi, Sam, I'm delighted to see you. Come on and join the party." That's kind of confusing to a child. For a long time, I couldn't admit that my father was not around enough of the time when I needed him. Because when he was around, he made me feel that he was happy to be with me. There aren't too many pictures of the two of us together. Dad had his own life, separate from mine. I guess my biggest doubt about my father was whether he loved me as much as the company, as he loved the company, because the company was obviously a consuming passion of his. And sometimes I felt maybe I was just an instrumentality of his to carry on what he had created versus genuine affection. And but I think later I realized, and I now realize that and particularly as I read some of these things that he wrote again, that he had a genuine affection for me. As long as I live, I'll remember the mighty Amazon.
It's impossible to imagine the river's size unless you see it. At its mouth, the river's power is so immense, it can hold back the ocean's tide.
I think I felt him most when we were flying up the Amazon. Everybody was kind of mesmerized by this huge river and the jungle just going off continuously into the horizon, where you couldn't see anything except the river and the jungle and the horizon. You felt like you were in a different world. We were alone, and there isn't a boat, there isn't a farm, there isn't a plane in the sky. There is nothing there but yourselves in a wonderful old airplane making a big noise. And you're thinking about, why am I here? And then you begin to think about my father and his having done that. And that was the high point, I think, was when we were absolutely alone. After many days of flying over South America, our expedition, like my father's, finally reached Brazil. They had sent a message ahead that they were okay and that they were going to stay overnight there. And so when he landed in Pará, they arrested him as smugglers, and particularly they thought this word okay meant that they had the contraband on board. They picked it up and were bringing it in. The military authorities detained them in the town while the matter was being investigated. For 3 weeks he was delayed while they got it all straightened out.
I watched the fruit of a mango tree outside my hotel window. When we arrived in Pará, the fruit was green. When we left, it was ripe and golden and dropping to the ground.
I think his confinement set him free in a way. He spent his days strolling through the markets, meeting the people. There was even a carnival going on. After all the strains of home, my father found himself with happy people, bright lights, and dancing. He loved to dance.
Oh, yeah, we was there a long time. We had, we met some girls. Some of these were walking up and down in front of the hotel, so we went across the street in the park, and we went over and talked to them. And they were going to a dance, and we went to the dance. We had to get white suits real quick.
My father, obviously being, at that time, a single person, was meeting various people, and I think he probably met some women along the way, because there's one that appears in his book. And I've always been curious about who that was, and whether there was a romance, which I think he said in the book, one of the many attractions of Pará. That kind of indicates to me that it wasn't just a casual meeting on the street, that there was something more to it than that. He never wrote of the woman in the sketch. I think whoever she was, this woman, and eventually the Brazilian people themselves, began to open up my father's heart again. took my father's expedition 6 weeks after leaving Miami to reach the coastal town of Fortaleza. Much had changed since the days of my father, but the jangadas still lined the beach. When my father saw that the children didn't have any milk, he decided to ship down a herd of brown Swiss cows from Wisconsin. I met a man whose cows were descendants of that herd. When my father discovered they needed a school, he built one, and it exists till this day. The Brazilians were quite interested in what my father was up to. Once settled in Fortaleza, he set up a research laboratory. And then he made several trips by plane to the interior and located where the highest concentrations of the Carnauba palm was. He was looking for a site where he could establish a plantation to grow and study the Carnauba palm, and to see if he couldn't find a more efficient way to harvest the leaves and collect the wax. He called the plantation Raposa. When you get to Fortaleza and you see this palm, it is unique on the horizon. It's a kind of all round where the leaves are, and it's very tall and very straight, and it is the only thing that seems to flourish in that particular kind of environment. All of the other plants and trees are kind of destroyed in the alternate dry periods that they go through in the northeast part of Brazil. But the palm does very well because it's the wax on the leaves that protects the life of the palm. But wax isn't Carnauba's only benefit. The natives use the fruit for food for the animals, and the trunk for their building their huts, and the thatched roofs are the palm leaves as the roof. The roots are used for medicine. And so it was aptly called the tree of life by the Brazilians, and that stirred my father's imagination, stirs my imagination, and he would talk about it kind of reverently. I discovered many years later that after establishing Raposa, he planted very ceremoniously 2 Carnauba palms, 10 inches tall there. Eventually, Raposa outlived its usefulness, and my father gave it to a Brazilian university. Although it wasn't on our original itinerary, I decided to see what had become of Raposa. In the article that Time magazine wrote about my father, below his picture, the caption read, "He seeks the tree of life." As the years went by, this trip became more of a turning point in the family and the company. He came back invigorated. He remarried. He had Frank Lloyd Wright design our home and company offices. He returned with a visionary view of the world and took the company in new directions. I think my father saw something of himself in that palm because it represented strength. It represented sustainability. It represented a benefit to the community. And I think my father could identify with that. And that's probably the reason that he put it on the tomb, or wanted me to put it on the tomb, was because of those qualities. And particularly the sustainability of it through the droughts, that it could survive the rigors of bad weather. As we walked around Raposa, there was really very little left of it. I would go back to my grandfather's speech in 1927. The big buildings, for all their solidity, must someday be replaced. And in this case, the big buildings were practically gone. But what was still there was the spirit of Carnauba, because those trees, those palms, were still standing strong and tall and beautiful. There were the palms my father had planted. It was as if my father was standing right there before me, waiting for me, saying to me, "You came, Sammy." Walking up to those palms, I really felt like I was walking up to my father. For a moment, I was a child again, looking up at my dad, and he was just as I remembered him. I thought, there he is. There's my father and what he had done. It was then that I knew I had fulfilled the wish my father had had for me. Sammy, I hope one day you can make this trip. As I thought about the plantation and what my father had done, and then thinking also about the future, I guess I came to the conclusion that as a son, I shouldn't worry too much about whether I have lived up to the expectations of my father, but whether we as fathers live up to the expectations of our children. I think it was a wonderful way to recollect my father, to kind of reestablish him as a principal person in my life. That is what it did. It brought him to life again for me. That's what it did. And that was worth it, to bring him back into my mind and to see his face and to see my father in that airplane and to see my father in that palm tree, and then understand again what he was all about and why he was so important to me and the family.